Good day, and welcome to Living Well in Montana. Living Well in Montana is a program of living independently for today and tomorrow, or what we call LIFTT. LIFTT is a nonprofit center for independent living. We're a resource and advocacy center for persons of all ages with all types of disabilities, and we serve 18 counties in south central and southeastern Montana. My name is Jed Barton, and I am the Communications and Government Affairs Coordinator at LIFTT. And today our program will be discussing elevating accessibility in community planning. One of our core services at LIFTT is to help shape a world that that allows people with all types of disabilities to live as independently as possible as integrated members of their communities. And one of the ways we do that is by working with folks like our guests today on issues of community planning. Our guests today are Mark Fenton. Mark is a planning and transportation consultant based in the Boston area. Yeah. And Karin Korb. And Karin is an equity consultant, and her home base is the Fort Lauderdale, Florida area. And thank you both for being here. Welcome to Billings and welcome to Montana.
It's great to be here. I love any opportunity to come back and visit.
Me too. Montana is beautiful.
Thank you. So what brought you to Billings this time?
We were lucky to be invited through your work and partners, including, by the way, the Montana Disability and Health Program and the Department of Health and Human Services, to join and participate in the Montana Association of Planning meetings. So Billings was the host for the last several days for planners from all over the state coming together, and people that work in fields related to planning. There were some transportation engineers, there were some consultants, there were some public health folks at this conference for 3 days at the Doubletree right in downtown Billings, and we were lucky enough to be participants and actually host some sessions. So it was really spectacular. It was great to work with the people
Full
here.
disclosure, I was fortunate enough to participate in those sessions. So in again, you gave the keynote yesterday afternoon, Mark, and then Mark and Karin, you led yesterday afternoon what is called an I2 walk audit with a group of us through a section of downtown Billings. If you want to talk a little bit about what an I2 walk audit is.
Go ahead, Mark, and I'll jump in.
Okay, so we made that acronym up, and I'm going to give Karin credit for helping the small working group of us, and we've worked with a colleague, Meg Tracy, who is at University of Montana, the Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities there. And the idea of an I2 audit is the I's are Inclusive Interdisciplinary Walk Move Audits. And we use that term because this idea of walk audits actually has been growing over the last decade or so. Planners use them in communities when they're about to do a zoning update, or when they're about to do work on a roadway or a corridor. They might actually go out and walk that route. And what we realized is often those audits had only the easiest people to include. Like you might invite the public works person and the planner and maybe the road engineer, but they didn't often include community voices, and they often didn't represent the range of lived experiences in the community. So one of the things we've been working on is thinking about how do we do that better? How can we make an audit like that where we get out and move through the space inclusive and truly interdisciplinary. Make sure that people from public health and from the business community and from housing and transportation, right? Even though they may not be responsible, or the transit agency, maybe they're not responsible for that road, but they're all people that are going to be influenced by the road, including the business owners along that corridor. And how do we make it inclusive of all the voices and all the lived experiences, people that are older and younger, and people with a range of abilities and disabilities, and people from different socioeconomic classes and different races and backgrounds. And so those two words, inclusive and interdisciplinary, may seem sort of pedantic, but they are really representative of what we consider a successful audit. Because if you get all those people to go out and move through a space together, you get a much fuller picture of how a road might be redesigned or how a subdivision might be built to work for everybody.
And again, you talk about redesigning roads and redesigning subdivisions, and again, you talked yesterday in the keynote, and Karin, you mentioned this too, about how we've been building society one way for at least since the Second World War.
That's right.
And how not only for environmental concerns, but for public health concerns and for, creating community and creating access, we need to start looking at another way of doing things. So what is that?
What we also know to be true, Jed, is that people, the most marginalized people or the most minoritized people, have pretty much historically never been included in these, what we would call upper level conversations. And we're building communities without taking the representation of the people who actually live, move, breathe, and work in these communities. So one of the transitions is the word move, because we got that feedback actually from the independent living representatives. They came back and said, well, I don't want to be part of a walk audit because I don't walk. And I found that really interesting. So we took that feedback and said, what is a more inclusive word for that? And that is move, because we all move in many, many different ways, right? And so that's how it became the inclusive walk move audits.
Right, and that was evident yesterday in the group we had. We had representatives of all 4 centers for independent living here in Montana,
That's right.
as well as the delegates to the planning convention and some folks from the City of Billings engineering department. And we moved through a section of downtown. For those of you who are familiar with downtown Billings, we started at the Doubletree and we went down
Montana. That's right.
East on Montana Avenue over to 25th, and then north on 25th to, I want to say 3rd.
The transit center,
Yeah.
right there at the transit center.
To the
3rd.
Well, usually
Billings
we'll
Met
take
Transit.
we'll take a subsection of an area, Mark and I, or whoever's on the team for that time, we'll take a subsection of the area, we'll scout the route, and we'll look for a small area, sometimes maybe a mile or so, and that is comprised of many different, I would call it the vibe. Like, what is the downtown vibe? And then we look at very specific pieces of infrastructure that maybe are inhibiting to someone's participation for hanging out downtown, and maybe like all the good things that are going on downtown, and how we look at road speeds and what's happening with pedestrian traffic, and do we see cyclists out there, parents with strollers, and all the different things that make a really cool community.
And it was striking to me that yesterday, right off the bat, there on Montana Avenue, we saw sort of the good and the not so good immediately. That, again, Montana Avenue is as lively a street as we have in Billings. There are numerous restaurants of varying kinds, and I think there's other businesses down there, and a couple of our microbreweries are on Montana, and our historic train depot is there. But again, you've got some negatives. Depending the as fast as traffic moves in that one-way street, and some of the brick in the sidewalk, which again, for folks who have trouble navigating uneven surfaces, whether on foot or wheeled or otherwise, presents a challenge. And Mark, you were saying that some of that brick, it wasn't like it was there in 1888 when the Northern Pacific Railroad constructed the original Montana Avenue. But it's there. It's been put back there, or put there to sort of faux recreate that historical.
So often it's it's an attempt at sort of an aesthetic treatment, and we forget what the long-term maintenance costs can be and what the accessibility challenges might be. And to Karen's point, when we think about accessibility, it's not just, for example, a wheelchair user. It could be a range of people. We talked to one of the young women, I think, had some heels on her shoe, and she said, every one of those little lips is a tripping hazard, as it would be for my 85-year-old parents potentially.
Right.
And what's interesting is, you were alluding before, we talked about this in the session with the planners. When you do really inclusive design like this, we think there's kind of a triple bottom line benefit. There's certainly a public health benefit if people can be out and be physically active, because we know, the Surgeon General and the Department of Health and Human Services say, it'd be great if every adult could average about 30 minutes of physical activity a day. It would reduce your risk for cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and osteoporosis and clinical depression and a bunch of cancers. So being active is important from a health standpoint. We learned, by the way, during the COVID pandemic, people who are more physically active were less susceptible to severe COVID. They were better, their bodies were better ready to fight COVID. Okay, so there's a public health benefit. We know there's an environmental health benefit, right? If we can have fewer cars on the road, fewer emissions, right? If we didn't have to make such big parking lots, we don't have all the stormwater runoff and all the heat island effect that comes from those big paved surfaces. But we also know, and Montana's an example of this, there's an economic health benefit. Places like this that are accessible to more broad and inclusive parts of population, whether it's the employees who have to access those restaurants and cafes or all the customers, right? You make what people will call a walkable downtown or a walkable district like that, it's going to be a district where it becomes that thriving sort of hip, cool place, where the vibe, like we were talking about, is really positive. And we talked about that. We said, and you could fix some of those structural things, like taking out that brick and making it ornamentation on the edge, but not the main treadway where you're trying to travel. Fixing some of the curb ramps. Maybe rethinking, like Billings is, the one-way streets that really invite a lot of traffic speed, and restoring the fact that they were originally two-way streets, slows the traffic down, makes them more accessible.
29th right out here.
Recently redone, right?
Recently done.
And we call them restoration. Some people call them two-way conversions. But all you're doing is restoring it to what it originally was.
Because very few of those streets were one way from time immemorial.
Because look at Montana Ave. It was, the speed limit is 25. And I don't think I saw a single car or a scooter, a motorcycle driving 25. It was more like 60 in a highway. And that's frightening. And there's literally, I think, 4 or 5 pedestrian crosswalks.
Right, and right in that section.
In the sequence. And, if you're a pedestrian, the train station, there are people walking about, there's restaurants. That's a scary place if you want to even just cross the street.
Can be challenging. So it was it's really instructive to go out and experience that all together, and it's not a blame game. Nobody's pointing the fingers saying, this is your fault. Your department didn't do that. Quite the contrary. We call it an act of shared discovery. These I2 audits are everybody discovering it and sharing their experience and what's working for them and by the way, we intentionally try to include places where people are going to say, this is great, wow, let's replicate more of this, because then that can inform the places that are more challenging. You can say, okay, what could we do? What did we see 2 blocks over that we liked that we want to apply here?
Right.
Because you're doing creative stuff in Billings. When we went down 29th, to your point, one of the streets that had the restoration, we saw a couple of interesting things. We saw what's called back-in angled parking. Well, that's much safer for a bicyclist out on the street there, because a car is pulling out frontwards. And by the way, for a driver, because when you open the car doors, kids go back toward the sidewalk. And when mom puts something in the trunk, she's standing on the sidewalk, not out in the street. So once we experience that, we could say, maybe we want to do more of this. We saw a little parklet, one parking space where a little seating area had instead been created for one of the little bistros there. And everybody said, wow, cool idea here. Could we do more of these? Could we make sure they're accessible, that there's not a step there, so everybody could get there and seat at that? That experience, right, that collected experience, we think can inform sort of the next generation of the work that's happening here.
Yeah, we ask people to score in our group. Like on a scale of 0 to 10, is this a good place, right? 10, amazing. Or is it not so good, 0 to maybe 3? And it's fascinating to me how people will score one area an 8. And I would look at that as a disabled person, oh my gosh, that's a 2 for sure. And then there's this active, beautiful discussion that happens. And most of the time, and it's reciprocal learning. And most of the time, people will be like, oh, we never thought about that before. Because my experience, Mark's experience are vastly different. And how do we come together and go, okay, as we're creating and planning the community further to beautify the area or to make it more accessible or to create more opportunities to go and spend money or hang out in the vibe? I mean, how do we do that? Well, we can't do that without having these conversations.
Right, exactly. And those of you just joining us, this is Living Well in Montana, a program of living independently for today and tomorrow, a resource and advocacy center for people with disabilities in 18 South Central and Southeastern Montana counties. My name is Jed Barton, and I am the Government Affairs Coordinator at LIFTT, and I am here today with Karin Korb, an equity consultant, and Mark Fenton, a planning and transportation consultant, and we're discussing elevating accessibility in community planning. Now, we've talked sort of in specifics about the work you've done in Billings and some of the other work you've done and Mark, you've been all over Montana and some of our smaller communities as well. Again, you showed some slides yesterday of Broadus, Montana, and southeastern Montana, which is definitely part of LIFTT's service area.
Sure. Red Lodge.
Red Lodge is part of our service area. Roundup, you mentioned.
Yeah.
And when people think about these community designing and urban planning, and we think of even cities bigger than Billings, we think of places like your home, Boston.
Right.
But communities need to be created in all shapes and sizes and
densities.
Densities, right? And so, So what?
Well, it's right. It's really a good point. And we tried to highlight that at the planning conference because there were people from a range of communities. I saw a colleague from Red Lodge who had, was here at the conference, and from some of those very communities you were just listing, up in Shelby, right? So and I think the reminder is, in fact, small communities historically were some of the most eminently walkable. They were what I call park once communities, that even if you lived out in a rural area, that's where you did your shopping and your commerce. You would drive into town, get out of your car, and then you'd be able to do everything under human power, not under vehicle power. And you could move from place to place because you could go to the bank and the post office, the grocery and the pharmacy and the hardware. So the raw bones of those kinds of small communities, like the ones you just mentioned, often were on a scale that would have made them very accessible to somebody who's not in a vehicle, not necessarily in a car. And then what happened is often Main Street became the state highway. And the character of the road changes pretty dramatically. Often, you'll find a two-lane highway when it gets into one of those towns. We showed Roundup, there's a great example of it goes to 4 lanes. The idea being we were trying to accommodate turning movements and all that. But what we really did was highwayify Main Street, bring speeds up and make it, almost dehumanize it, right? It was great for vehicle movement, blow right through town, or turn if you wanted to, but not so great for getting across from the cafe on one side of the street to the bank on the other. And many people would argue it helped the demise of those small communities. So when we talk about this stuff, it really is about the economic as well as the quality of life, the economic life, the quality of life, the environmental life of those communities. And so those kind of communities, quite intentionally, we included those, and we had, I think, pretty vibrant discussions in the planners, saying, okay, so how do we make sure that a street like that, a main street like that, functions for the traffic that has to move through, but actually respects the people who live in the community on a day-to-day basis, that are just trying to get kids to school, to get to their jobs, to get to their grocery store, and respects what their needs are every day. And it can be done. Communities across the state are doing this stuff. We use as an example Ennis, where we had a couple of I-2 audits, where they've made some modest, but I think significant improvements to some of the street crossings, to the quality of the sidewalks, improvements in accessibility, which, by the way, perhaps were driven by the I-2 audit, and we would think about things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, but what you discover immediately, everybody in that town is benefiting. And I showed a slide of a bunch of kids just walking to the neighborhood the daycare to a neighborhood park, and that same sidewalk which Karin would have instructed me on how to design it properly so it worked great for her, worked great for all those little kids in that, right? In that daycare, and the teachers who were walking them to school or to the park safely.
Yeah.
You get a better product for everybody is a really simple, oversimplified way of saying it, but I think it gets to the heart.
I think it's also really important to note that for anyone who's listening, like, this isn't about being anti-car or anti-truck. That's not what this is about. This is about creating areas where, because there's enough, we strongly believe there's enough to go around.
Yeah.
Right? And if we plan these things, and I don't want to even use the word correctly, but if we plan these places, spaces, and things utilizing the people that live there and planners and all traffic engineers, then you get it, like Mark said, a better product where everyone can use the area with just loving ease and comfort.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's like we were just saying, the parking downtown may be safer for bicyclists. I'd argue it's way better for drivers too. You don't have people backing blindly out into your lane.
Oh,
right?
when
you're backed in. Yeah, exactly. It's a simple thing. But so, okay, so we managed to improve that for absolutely everybody who's using that environment, and that's the way to go.
Okay. So talk a little bit about how you came to this work, both of you.
Oh, wow. The short story, obviously, I broke my back as a gymnast when I was 17, and I never had plans to do this type of work, but what was happening to me is I couldn't get anywhere. Here's a significant example. I remember hanging out with my friends, that's what you do when you're 17, and everyone was going after hours to a diner, and I had to use a separate entrance. And it was raining, and I had to ring a doorbell on the side, and it was raining, and I was wet, and then they had to move all the furniture, and then I became the object of the restaurant extravaganza. It was so strange to me, and at that moment, it was a very pivotal moment for me, and I said, I am going to do something to change this, and that's when I decided to go to law school. It changed the entire trajectory of my career, and then as time went on, just meeting different people in these places and spaces, and having these conversations, these really righteous conversations about how do we include different types of people in these spaces that is ease, right? And so it's been almost 30 years of doing this work. Yeah.
And Mark, you had some experience in the human performance
field. I actually studied exercise, biomechanics at MIT. I was an engineer, mechanical engineering, and I was working with actually gait studies in stroke rehabilitation and so on. And then I even worked with sports performance. So I worked at the U.S. Olympic Training Center with elite athletes there. And so I got these bachelor's and master's degrees, and I thought, okay, I'm going to be either a guy that invents the unbelievably super cool state-of-the-art prosthetic leg or arm, right? Because there's a lot of engineering in those things, and there's been a lot of innovation in that world. Or maybe I'll be the guy that works at the Olympic Training Center and we figure out sort of how to release the javelin at precisely the right angle so that we win the Olympic medal. And it's cool to work with elite athletes and all. It was really fun. What I realized, though, from a public health standpoint, I wasn't doing much good at all at focusing on that sort of esoterica of competitive sports. And indeed, I began reading the public health literature and realizing that what we're finding is, if you look at society, American society at large, we are not that physically active. We are a sports-minded society. We love watching our sports, but from a physical activity standpoint, a fraction of Americans meet that 30-minute per day recommendation that I alluded to before. Just getting out for a 30-minute walk. That fraction may be as few as 1 in 10 or even 1 in 20 adults. Where it seems like because we drive everywhere, because our jobs are increasingly sedentary, because our recreation is increasingly screen-based, whether it's a little screen or a big screen, we're not moving, right? And as you learn more about that, you come to realize that simply telling people to exercise, or for that matter, eat their broccoli, is not nearly as effective as making it easy to do so. Give me a great farmer's market nearby with locally grown, high-quality produce at a reasonable price that everybody in the community can access, and that's when we see nutrition improve. Give me a community where it's easy for people to walk and bike and roll to school, where people have an option to take transit to work and thereby, go to and from a bus stop at either end of their trip and get their daily physical activity by virtue of 2 short 15-minute walks rather than a 30-minute ride in the car. That became actually a driving realization. I didn't know it at the time when I was starting to study this. I had grown up as what I call a free-range kid. You've heard of free-range chickens? I was a free-range kid growing up in a small community.
Too.
You were, upstate New York, small community. Took off on a Saturday morning with a bunch of friends on our bikes, could be roaming town all day. Walked to the movie theater, to a corner store, to our favorite pizza shop. Most American kids today may not be experiencing that free-range experience. And we talked about that to the planners, and I think most of them agreed that it's part of our collective responsibility to try to restore that, to build worlds where everybody can be free range and can navigate their landscape, sort of under their own power if they can.
And from the equity perspective, and that's why it is so important to include our youth in these groups, in these discussions, because we forget about that. We really do. We forget. We're constantly with our degrees and our knowledge. We always think we know what's best for our kids in the community, but we're not even asking them. And if their priorities are screen time, well, tell us about your experience and how do we do this work while you get to still use your screen time? How do we get you to move while you're still doing all your other stuff, right? Because that's their vibe and they are the future. But most of the time we're not asking them, and it's not just white kids. We got to have black kids and brown kids and trans kids and gay kids and straight kids and all the people. And that is so critically important as we keep moving forward and building these beautiful places and spaces.
Right, and it's not just differences in race, there's differences in ability and how we see the world, you see it as a wheelchair user, or as how I see it as someone who uses leg braces, AFOs, I guess is the technical term.
Someone who is blind, someone with a visual impairment, someone who is deaf or has a hearing impairment, someone who's neurodiverse, because what we also know about disability, it's so nuanced. And sometimes you have a visible, non-visible, an apparent, a non-apparent, so there's a lot of stuff going on. Some people don't even know that they have a disability or don't want to disclose that they have a disability. Right. And why should you, just to get access, right? Because the whole goal is to show up and be able to participate however you show up.
Exactly. I think we'll leave it there.
Nice.
Thank you, Mark Fenton and Karin Korb.
Correct.
Karin Korb, for sharing your thoughts about this elevating accessibility in community planning. If you're interested in the work of LIFTT, please visit our website at www.lift.org or give us a call here in Billings at 259-5181, or we've just launched a new mobile app. You can search LIFTT, LIFTT, in the Google Play or Apple Store and find our app.
Nice.
Thank you and have a good day.